Erika Hall, as you all know, that's why you're here, and assistant professor in Goizueta, professor of organization and management. She came to our attention really 2 years ago. Jack Chef started saying, why don't you invite Erika? Why don't you invite Erika? And I tried very hard to get her scheduled about a year ago, last February, and she came up with the best ever excuse for postponing a presentation, namely that she was due to deliver her first baby on approximately the same day she was due to come to us. So we agreed to postpone. Little Isla has had her first birthday as of the end of last month, and here is Erika with us, raring to go. Very impressive, as Jack promised, and a very long CV. But I'll just mention undergraduate at the University of Maryland, and then both a master's and a PhD at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern. A couple of years in there in between when you were at Harvard, and then she came to Emory, started at Emory in 2014, and has just been all over the media ever since, and working very hard at getting other sorts of productions than Little Isla out, right? Chapters and books and articles and journals and presentations of all sorts all over the place. She'll be talking to us about one of her areas of special interest. The overall area of special interest is the intersectionality. That's the buzzword now, isn't it? But the concept and the fact has been around for a long time. That sort of overlapping minority categories of gender, of race, of class, and how they impact life in the world, and particularly life in the world of business. Today she's going to be focusing on racial prejudice and the way it complicates relationships between police and community people. So yeah, I think that's what I've got to say, and let me turn it over to her. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm very, very excited to be here, so thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me. Again, my name is Erika Hall. I'm an assistant professor of organization and management at the Business School, Goizueta Business School, and I'm going to present a paper that I wrote along with my colleagues Allison Hall and Jamie Perry in 2016. So the paper is a review paper. It reviews some of the psychological antecedents of the killings of unarmed Black men by police officers. And until today, I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't know that Black and Blue was also a song by Louis Armstrong. But thank you for letting me know. We picked it because we have two sections of our paper. One is Black, which deals with racial prejudice, and the other is Blue, which deals with how police officers are trained and come together as a collective unit, and how maybe that's a great thing to have a brotherhood, but it might create more distinct inside and outsider distinctions. Okay? So two things before I get started. One is that this is the one paper that I have on my CD that my colleagues and I look around and say, I really hope this paper is irrelevant in 5 years. Right? I really hope that it's irrelevant. And unfortunately, we said that when we started the paper in 2014, protest. We said that when it was published in 2016, and now we're here in 2018. And just a week ago, Marielle Franco, who was a councilwoman, a black councilwoman in Rio de Janeiro, was gunned down and executed because she spoke out openly about police brutality in Rio de Janeiro. So we've gone through 4 years here, and you'll see when I present kind of the stream of events, popularized events of these unarmed killings, that this has started way, way back, right? And it's still continuing. The second thing is, I was wondering if you were questioning a little bit why I'm in a business school and I'm studying this, right? So you may think, okay, political science, I see it situated there. Sociology, maybe I see it situated there. So let me just give you a background about myself as a researcher. So I got my PhD in management at the Kellogg School of Management, and there I was trained with a psychological background, specifically with experiments, and I studied race, class, and gender-based implicit biases and biases in organizational environments, right? For this particular project, I'll just tell you, it was a passion project. It was a passion project. So I was sitting around with my colleagues, and it was right after Mike Brown had just died in 2014. And we were talking about how helpless we felt sitting in the ivory tower, where we had activist friends that were going out to Ferguson and helping out on the ground, and we didn't feel like we could do that, or we didn't feel like we had the capabilities to do that. So what gifts did we then have that we could lend to this problem that we saw in the world? So one thing that we thought that we could do uniquely was we could write a paper talking about kind of these antecedents, or how do these things actually work? How could it be that nobody says, hey, I'm racist, right? Yet things like this happen. The other thing that we felt like we were particularly well situated to do was, because we do experimental designs and we understand experimental design, we can isolate the causal factors in a particular mechanism, or that cause a particular outcome, right? And this was interesting for this particular stream of work because a lot of people will write off these situations as anomalies. So there are always idiosyncratic factors where they said, well, you know, this victim, this kid, he smoked a lot of marijuana, right? Or this kid, you know, he had a criminal record. And they look at one-off instances. But we could look at them in aggregate, that's one thing we could do, but we could also isolate race as a causal factor and empirically test, well, was it actually race, or was it all these idiosyncratic factors that keep coming up with each of these instances, right? Okay. So like I said, black deals with the racial bias, and blue deals with the police officer standpoint and how police officers are cultivated and trained that might spark insider and outsider distinctions. Today, I'm only going to focus on the black racial bias part for two reasons. One is that that's my particular specialty, racial bias. The blue part was more my co-author. And the other is that, you know, we don't have that much time. I could talk for hours about this, right? But I think that this is critical, and I think we'll get a lot out of it. Okay, so Brittany Cooper, who is a public intellectual, wrote this article in an online magazine, Salon, and she covered my research in it and also made it a little bit of a memoir. And the title was provocative that she provided for this. The title was, "It's the Blackness That Scares Them." The blackness that scares them. I thought this was really interesting, and actually I thought the article was a good representation of my work, and she had popularized it. But this idea that it's the blackness that scares them, that black could be encoded with all of these things that are dark and threatening to people, whereby they might feel like they have to alleviate that threat in ways that harm blacks, right? It's the blackness that scares them. Let me go back for just 1 second. The research that she covered wasn't the research that I'm talking about today. It wasn't talking about police covering killings, but I do feel that it has a place in this conversation. So I'm going to introduce you to that research study before I get into the killings of unarmed black men. So I did this study about the word black, whether it even had connotations or negative, it was bodied with negative stereotypes as compared to another word that we use, right? African American. Now, this came because I go to these cocktail parties at conferences, and we'd be sitting there having intellectual conversation, and I'd mention to my white counterpart, I'd just refer to myself as a black woman or black this, and this black person said, but the person would always respond back to me and say, yes, African American woman, yes, yeah. African American this, right? And so to me, it struck me as so odd because I'm thinking, I actually gave you license to say black, right? But instead, it was very intentional that you responded to me by saying African American. It's almost as if I call myself Erika and you respond and say I'm Jackie, right? It was just as odd to me. So I was thinking, are there any negative connotations or embodiment, even in the word black itself? Is it really the blackness that scares them that is not even seen in other labels? So I went where all research kind of starts these days, and that's the Google search bar. Has anybody done this before? Right? And I went to Google Images, and I just typed in the phrase black people. And these are the pictures that I got. Not sure if you're able to see. Now, none of these pictures were surprising. They're awfully discriminatory and prejudicial, right? But I'm a race researcher, so that is what I expected to find. Okay. So then I went into Google image search bar and I just typed in the word African American people. Should be the same images, right? But here's what I got. A vastly different picture, right? One that spoke about history, culture, things of that sort. And since this was so stark, I continued on and tried to study it a little bit more scientifically. Okay? So I did this content analysis where I assigned one group of people, this is how I do it in experiments, I randomly assigned one group of people to evaluate black people. So I told them, assign 10 traits that you think are most representative of black people. And another group of people, I said, assign 10 traits that you think are most representative of African American people, and then another of white people, right? Then I had a whole different group then rate each of these traits on their negativity, the status, the warmth, and the confidence of the traits. So this is how we were going to measure the stereotype content of these groups. So here's the stereotype content, if you can see, of blacks, but it's more interesting when you compare it to African Americans. These are all statistically significant differences where you see the negativity was less for African Americans than for blacks. And African Americans were also considered to be higher status, higher warmth, and confidence. Interestingly enough, there was no difference, actually, no significant difference between whites and African Americans, just whites and blacks, or African Americans and blacks. So it started getting me thinking, like, is it really the blackness that scares them? Is there something encoded in blackness that's just particularly frightening? And because I am in a business school, I thought this has to have some major consequences organizationally. So I did another experiment, okay? And in this experiment, I had 2 application forms. They were identical, right? But I had 2 different groups of people rate them. They're identical except for one small factor that I'm not sure if this is big enough that you can see, but the race was presented differently. It either said black or it said African American. Everything else was the same. Then I organizational measures. One was, what salary do you think this person is going to command? What salary? So for the black candidate, $29,420. Okay. For the African American candidate, $37,040. Very significant difference, right? I asked them, what's the likelihood that this person is in a managerial position, that they'll be in a managerial position once hired? Okay. 38.5% thought that the black candidate was in a managerial position, compared to 73% of people who thought that the African American candidate was in a managerial position. Only difference was the word, identical application forms. So I thought, this is disheartening, right? But there has to be so many more consequences because these words are used interchangeably in American society, African American or black. Even if you look on the census, it's African American / black, right? So I was like, what are the consequences for the news and the media? What I did was I looked at all the crime reports in the 5 major U.S. news magazines. And then I looked for the presence of the word black versus African American. And then I coded the tone of the article using Loop, which is a linguistic inquiry word count software. What I found was the presence of the term black in crime reports was associated with negative emotion in that crime report or that article. And negatively correlated with positive emotion. The term African American had no such associations with it. Okay? So you think this is what people are reading every day. Is it really the blackness that scares them? The last experiment that I'm going to show you in this particular paper on this was the consequences for criminal justice. Now, luckily, I don't see these reports here very much, but when I was at Northwestern in Evanston, they would always send these emails of these crime reports. So they would say, a black suspect was seen running left on Lake Street after he accosted this student, right? You would get these as large blasts to keep people informed of what happened. So I just thought, well, they always use the term black. What if they use the term African American? So I experimentally manipulated this too. I either had a black suspect going left on Lake Street after accosting a student, or an African American suspect going left on Lake Street. And then I asked people, how warm do you feel to this suspect? So for black, very low warmth. In African American, significantly higher warmth, right? So it gets into this idea, right? Is it really the blackness that scares them? And is blackness so encoded with these negative connotations that it proves to be a threat? So in this presentation today and in the review paper that we wrote, we talked about these negative encodings of blackness. So black as violent or criminal, black as sub and superhuman, right? Both. Black youth as adult-like, and blacks as hierarchy disruptors. So I'm going to go through, walking through the studies that pertain to these 4 things. But I want to present you a real graph that's in our paper, and these are just the 30 most popularized in the media incidences of police killings of unarmed black men. So some that you might remember, Amadou Diallo in New York in the late 90s, right? Often forgotten because many of the more recent ones are kind of more poignant to or salient to people in their minds right now, but yes. Also Oscar Grant, who was killed when he was face down and handcuffed on a platform in the subway in Oakland. Oscar Grant. There was also a movie made about him later. Trayvon Martin, very popular one. A lot of people watched the court proceedings unfold, right? Who was holding Skittles and a Snapple when he was killed by George Zimmerman, who thought that he might be holding a weapon. And Mike Brown, in 2014, who actually set off kind of this zeitgeist or this fervor, Black Lives Matter, a string of hashtags that kind of motivated people and mobilized people to be more concerned about these string of killings. But there are far more than this that I've listed. The Washington Post, I believe, and also killedbythepolice.net record each instance where somebody was killed by the police. So if you'd like to take a look at the full list of when this has happened, a lot more exhaustive than this, that is present online. And it's interesting, too, because there's this chasm in the United States where some people feel that race was a causal factor for these killings, and some people feel that it wasn't a causal factor. There is also this divide down racial lines, where the tendency is for blacks to feel that race is more of an issue in U.S. society, and whites to feel that it is less so of an issue. And actually, psychologically, we understand this, right? If you think to yourself, well, I'm not racist, I don't have a racist bone in my body. The people that I associate, my family, my friends, they're not racist either. Could this really just be about something else? It's not actually about race at all. Maybe racism doesn't exist, okay? So one thing that we'll talk about today is how you could have this outward-facing egalitarian nature and not be racist yourself, but in your subconscious, there's implicit bias that connects certain things, connects blackness to negativity, right? And even though it's not in your conscious awareness, your behavior can be driven by your subconscious. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. Okay, so starting out with this connotation, is it the blackness that scares them, this coding of blacks as criminals? I'll introduce you to some really neat, I get really excited about psychological experiments, so really neat experiments to try to test this subconscious point of view that racism might be embedded a little bit deeper than we're aware of. One was done by Eberhard, and what it did was subliminally prime people with either a black face or a white face. So when I say subliminally prime, I mean that they very quickly flashed on a computer screen either the black or the white face, a lot slower than I just flashed right now, not available to your conscious mind, but registered by your subconscious mind. And then they presented several frames. The first frame was awfully distorted, right? You couldn't really make it out. And then each subsequent frame that goes across then got a little bit clearer, where finally, by frame 41, you knew that this object was a gun, you could identify the object. And so what the participant was tasked with was clicking when they could identify the object. So at what frame can you identify this as a weapon, or whatever it was? What they found was, if you were subliminally primed with this black face compared to this white face, you identified it as a weapon at an earlier frame, okay? Than if it were a white face. It took a little bit longer for you to distinguish that as a weapon. And this deals with underlying connotations that you have with blackness, right? Where you kind of piece together the image yourself and said, oh, this must be a weapon that was more psychologically available to you for a black face as compared to a white face. Now, when we try to do psychology, we try to relate it to the grander world, and we try to do that in our review paper as well. Think for this one about the Trayvon Martin case. So with Trayvon Martin, he was holding Skittles and a Snapple. And it was believed, or George Zimmerman believed, that he was holding a particular weapon, right? So when you think of studies like this, how it's nighttime, it's a distorted picture, that he may have seen a weapon, yeah, he may have seen it psychologically, more so because he kind of pieced that together in his brain, because weapons were more psychologically available to him at the moment, because he saw the blackness, or Trayvon Martin's race. So that's how these things come into play. Now, these studies got more and more developed over time. That was the Eberhard study. This one is by pane on the upper right. And what they did here was they either showed a cell phone or they showed a weapon. And you had to quickly determine on a computer whether it was a cell phone or a weapon, and they would look at your speed at which you recognized it as a weapon. They either put these objects on a black or a white face. So when it was seen on a black face, people very quickly knew that's a weapon, right? Yeah.
Who are the participants in this? Are they all white people?
It varies, actually. It varies.
Is there a difference by race in their response?
So I can give you a complicated answer to that. Yeah. They've done this. These are pretty robust studies. I'll show you the shooter bias studies. And they've done it with whites, police, blacks, every different type of population. And they found that this association is so strong that it even bypasses race. So they do find racial bias with black participants. Not necessarily as strong, but the cultural association of blackness with criminality, we all watch the same media, right? Is still there, even if it's not as strong. It's a great question. So they put either the weapon or the cell phone or black or white face, and people would more rapidly respond to it on the black face, knowing that it's a weapon. They got even more creative, and they did this in true natural settings, where they had a person in a park or a person in a school, and either holding a cell phone or a gun, and then they urged people to say, would you shoot this person? Are they a threat, or would you not shoot this person? The police actually took this paradigm, which is called the first-person shooter task. And I'm going to show a video about how the police use it.
Sir, drop that jacket right now!
During a chaotic situation or an arrest, police officers have to be ready for anything and be able to react.
Imagine the most stressful day you've ever had in your life and multiply it by about 1 million.
It is a life or death situation Todd Brown knows well. He's vice president of TI Training in Golden.
Freeze, police, don't move!
It develops shoot or don't shoot simulators used by police departments across the country.
So when you press a trigger, it's going to recoil like a real gun.
To see what officers go through every day, Brown put me through 2 simulations.
Let me see your ID.
The first, interviewing a man who looks like someone who's wanted for questioning. His uneasy nature enough to make me want to draw my weapon.
Every time a police officer makes contact with somebody, they don't know that person, okay? So everything they do is try to err on the side of safety.
Now I'm responding to a warehouse break-in. In the dark, I encounter a man after hearing someone call for help.
Show me both of your hands.
I fire after the man suddenly pulls out what I think is a gun. Turns out it was only a staple gun.
That's just a small example of a compressed time frame, adverse lighting condition where you had to make that split-second decision.
I work here!
Now look at the same simulation, only this time the man does have a gun. How would you react?
No room for lack of vigilance, and certainly these guys display it on a daily basis.
Okay, so slightly tangential, but this actually made me think of it. There's been new research done since we published our review article in 2016, which is that the man said the target seemed uncomfortable, like he was fidgeting and he seemed uncomfortable. Now there was research done showing that black men have such fear of the police, right, that the way that they interact when they meet a police officer is uncomfortable, right? It's fidgety. Is this going to be a good day or a bad day? Am I going to be in the news tomorrow, or am I going to walk away from this? And even this, to the police officers, makes them feel that the target is more guilty. But it's just that they are scared, so to say. My husband, whenever we encounter a police officer, whether it's good or bad, says, "You will do the talking. I am a black man." Right? So he gets very, very uncomfortable around them. And you can see how this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay. Okay, so Corral did a series of these shooter bias tasks, the real ones where they had to decide shoot or not shoot this person. That's either black or white, holding a cell phone or a weapon. And what they found was that the error rate of shooting unarmed people was much higher for blacks than it was for whites, right? And then for armed people, giving them the benefit of the doubt, saying, oh, they're armed, but I don't think they are, I'm not going to shoot, was much higher for whites than for blacks. so blacks were given the benefit of the doubt a lot less. In terms of response times, you'll see something similar. So your decision to shoot the unarmed person, or I'm sorry, your decision not to shoot the unarmed person, saying, oh, this person's okay, they're unarmed, came quicker for the white candidate rather than the black target, right? And your decision to shoot the armed person was quicker for the black candidate than the white target, suggesting that you made this decision a lot quicker to go ahead and pull the trigger. This factors into this thing called signal detection theory, which, although complicated, essentially just means that the criteria for shooting a black person is more lenient than the criteria for shooting the white person. Okay, so we have our baseline research on shooter bias. Let's go to your question and look at how is shooter bias manifested among different populations of participants, okay? So the first is novice undergraduates. So they're undergraduates that just come into the lab, they're freshmen. They find a huge tendency to shoot the black target and a tendency not to shoot the white target. These are the novice undergraduates. I always find this interesting to do as a guessing game. What do you think for community members? Worse or better than novice undergraduates? A little bit better? Well, definitely not as biased. They just shoot everybody. Yeah. So there is a significant difference than there's a higher tendency to shoot, but they also tend to shoot white targets as well. Maybe they're just primed. They're saying, I need to protect my house or whatever. Let's just shoot everybody. Police officers. This one's interesting. What do you think? Less. I hear less. Why less? Better training, right? Yeah. You're absolutely right. It's less. So they do have a tendency to shoot both white and black targets. This isn't a significant difference, but it's less so. Okay. Expert undergraduates. Now, expert undergraduates. This is interesting. This just means that they've gone through the shooter bias paradigm a couple of times. Okay, so these novice undergraduates, this was their first time, this was their first rodeo, but what the paradigm does is it gives you feedback. It says, you just shot an unarmed man. What are you going to do next time? And they say, oh, okay, I'm going to be better, right? So you think that after some training of doing this for a while, they get a little bit better. Expert undergraduates, yeah, you see after training that they have a tendency not to shoot both the white and black target. So they get a little bit better. They've done many different versions of this paradigm, and pro-stereotypic experts are interesting. All right, so pro-stereotypic experts are in the game. They've manipulated it where they've oversampled black targets with weapons and white targets with cell phones. They've oversampled that in the game, right? And they want to see that if they do this a while, is the bias going to grow stronger? And it does. So a huge tendency to shoot black targets when they see black targets a lot with weapons, and a huge tendency not to shoot the white targets. Now, interesting are special unit officers. The police officers I told you before are kind of general police officers. And we know police officers do a lot of different things, right? So they might pull over to help somebody that's stopped on the side of the road. That's part of what they do. Rarely do police officers see any gunfire, general police officers. Special unit officers are designed to just do one type of, or just deal with one type of crime. So they might be the DEA and they only deal with narcotics, or they only deal with gangs and special forces. What do we think about special unit officers? Shoot, I think you're right, yeah. So they too are like the pro-stereotypic expert. Huge tendency to shoot black target, huge, small tendency, but not to shoot white targets. Now, if we think of the design and the training, right, with the pro-stereotypic experts and the expert undergraduates, police officers, general police officers, as I say, they help people in need. They go into minority neighborhoods and they help mothers. They help people cross the street. They get a kid who's trapped in a tree. They help you, all different types of things. Special unit officers are only designed to go in that minority community and see gangs. That's all they're designed to see. So they're not dealing with all these people that are in need of their help, friendly people. They go in and they see black men with guns. And so this is just similar to the pro-stereotypic experts, right, who are trained over time to associate blackness with this criminality rather than blackness in the diverse array of citizens that we have. And this is the repercussion. Okay. Yes?
The whole thing, it comes under the heading of perceived self-defense, as I see it.
Perceived self-defense. Okay, can you tell me more?
Well, a person who's trained, as you show down there, won't hesitate to use a weapon if he feels that person is a threat.
Absolutely.
He doesn't want to be shot, so he's going to shoot first.
Yep. I totally agree with you. And
you could repeat that.
okay. So the comment was that this is or the police officer perceives this to be self-defense. If they see a threat, they're going to shoot first because they don't want to be shot. That's their life. And I think there isn't a truer statement. I think the problem that we have these days is not that people want to defend themselves, but that they are more likely to think that blacks are a threat than whites are a threat, holding all things equal, which means that the criteria for shooting a black person is a lot more lenient than the criteria for shooting a white person, even if they committed the same crimes or didn't commit crimes at all. So the problem to me is walking in, if I'm more likely to get shot but I didn't do anything just because of my race, it proves the problem. So it is the fact that this blackness is threatening. When I say it's the blackness that scares them, that's the main issue.
Excuse me.
Yes.
I'm a little confused
Okay.
because when you talk about black and whatever, you make it sound like it's black men and black women. But I would like to know also about how many differences there are between black women and white women and whether African American and so forth. So I'm a little bit wondering when you talk about black as subhuman, are you talking about black women and black men or what?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question because I do study specifically this concept of intersectionality, which is how do your racial and your gender groups intersect. I talk more about black men in this talk because it's more relevant in the media. You do see that black men are being shot at a higher rate than black women. In general, there have been studies done, shooter bias studies, as we have seen, on black women, and they find that the threat is not as strong. So it's something about the gender that kind of quells the threat of a black identity. So black men tend to have more of a threatening nature to people and tend to be more likely to get shot.
That's why your husband told you to speak when you saw a police officer.
Absolutely. Yeah. He tells me every time.
Could we save questions until she completes her presentation?
It's actually, I
Is
built
that-
in some
is that
time
okay?
for,
All right.
yeah, I built in, absolutely. Yeah.
Erika, can I ask, with regard to the special unit officers, how much would their experience with gangs in general play into that? It seems to me there's an expectation of violence which wouldn't necessarily be true of the other police officers.
I'd argue that that's the mechanism right there as you pinpointed it.
And Erica, you may need to repeat questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
I
The
apologize.
expectation.
Yeah, how much is it the expectation of violence that factors into the reason that special unit officers show this pronounced racial bias that police officers, general police officers, do not? I'd argue that it is this kind of experience that they've had where they only deal with violence and they only deal with criminality that is very similar to the pro-stereotypic experts that we saw with the undergraduates, where time over time, if it's oversampled, that they see blacks and weapons and they see whites and cell phones, then their mind is going to adjust and say, this is the training that I need. It is so that a black person is more likely to be a criminal. Yeah. So none of this, I'd argue, is intentional. And that's actually beyond my scope, whether people are explicitly prejudiced or not. I'm saying these things happen at a subconscious level. And one more thing, I'm sorry, and I will get to your question, but I did want to note that with all of these studies, they also ask about explicit prejudice. So they give them a scale that's called the modern racism scale. Now, on the modern racism scale, they ask questions like, blacks are pushing themselves where they shouldn't go, or blacks have been demanding more than they deserve these days, and they indicate whether they agree with these statements or not. So there's subconscious implicit associations that you see with the shooter bias task are unassociated with their scores on their explicit measures. So even though they might personally say, I'm not racist, this happens on a subconscious level that they're not even aware of. Sorry, in your question.
How black do they have to be? Because obviously not all black people look the same.
Sure.
Have they done it with gradations of darker skin and lighter skin people who identify as African American?
So that's a great question, because a new burgeoning area of research is stereotypicality research, which is within gradations of the black race, are there people that are more likely to have this punishment? I can't speak to the shooter bias studies incorporating stereotypicality, but I can speak to some other work that's really interesting. So there was this one study where they looked at all the different people that were on death row. This was at Eberhart studies, and they have pictures of all the people on death row, and also the larger set of people that they came from. Okay, so meaning the other criminals that weren't yet sentenced. And they find that the more that they have Afrocentric features, which is wide nose, darker skin, and tightly coiled hair, the more that they're likely to have been sentenced for the death penalty. Yeah, this was a psychological science study by Eberhart. So your intuition is absolutely correct.
To the point at which somebody is going to identify a person as black in short time limits. If you only got a split second to decide at some level, is this person black or white? And that's
yes, and it doesn't even actually have to deal with that dichotomy, so to say. So it could be a fair-skinned black person, and they could identify them as black, but they still wouldn't think they were as threatening if they were darker. So this even precedes kind of the decision of saying this is a black or white person. I'm relating to the threat of the blackness of the person. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so another thing that blackness is encoded with is the idea of being subhuman. Now, we saw this paradigm before where there was a prime or a flash of a black person and a flash of a white person, right? And then we saw whether they could identify a gun. With this particular study, they wanted to know if you could identify this image. So the frames progressed and got clearer until you found out it was this ape, right? And what they found was, if you were primed with the black person, subconsciously, subliminally primed, you identified this as an ape at an earlier frame than if you were primed with the white person. It took you longer. I'll show you the graphs about this data. So if you were primed with the white face, it took you 27 frames to figure out that's an 8. But if you were primed with a black face, took you right about 20. This difference between black and white, and this is no prime at all. Okay? So this is the inner association with blacks as apes, being even less than human, or 3/5 of a human, right? So it gets even more disheartening, unfortunately. In their second study, in their paper, they primed people with this 8 prime, and they either had participants look at a video of police brutality of a black victim or a white victim. And then their question was, how justified was this beating? Right? So after being primed with an 8, the black suspect they felt was more justified to be a victim of this police brutality than the white suspect. Why? Because if they're relating him to an ape or an animal, then you're not even human, so you don't have the feelings. I can beat you a little bit more and not feel the empathy for you. Okay? Overall, in this paper, they found that race, black versus white, was associated with apes, which was associated in justified police brutality against you if they associated you with an ape. But oddly enough, blacks are also perceived to be superhuman. Now, how can you be both subhuman and superhuman and not even human at the same time? You completely cross over. Okay, Darren Wilson, who executed, as I would say, Mike Brown, had this exclusive interview on ABC News. And in the interview, he says, when I grabbed him, the only way I can describe it is it felt like I was a 5-year-old holding on to Hulk Hogan. He said, Hulk Hogan, that's how big he felt and how small I felt just from grasping his arm. Does everybody know who Hulk Hogan is? Yeah. Okay. So Hulk Hogan was this wrestler with like superpowers, right? You could buy video games of him because he's extremely strong, not even human, just kind of like this superpower. So they did a study to test people's association with blacks and this superhumanness. And what they used was the implicit association test. Okay? The implicit association test can be a little bit complicated to explain, so I've provided a video that does it where you can also see the platform. But essentially what this IAT does is it measures how much you implicitly associate blackness with good things and what blackness with bad things and white with good things. I'll show you.
When the test first begins, you will be shown 2 of the categories, in this case African American and European American, and you'll be asked to pair items into their correct category just to make sure you know which items belong in which category. So to put something in the left category, you press the E button, and to put something in the right category, you press the I button. So this would be I, this would be E, I, E, and so on and so forth. Now you're shown the next set of categories, and you're matching words into them just like you did in the last set. Now 2 categories are paired, in this case African American and good. And this is the most important part of the test, because the implicit association test measures your associations based on how quickly you respond. So if you respond more quickly when African American and good are paired, rather than when African American and bad are paired, that means you have an implicit preference for African American. You may have noticed that once I place an item into its correct category, the next item appears. But if I place an item in the incorrect category, a red X will appear, such as here, and it will remain there until I place it in the correct category. The pairings have now been switched so that African American is paired with bad and European American is paired with good. This is to test how quickly you respond to this opposite pairing as opposed to the initial pairing.
Okay, so a quick summary of this is just if you associate blackness, a quick summary is just if you're able to do the pairings when African American is with bad quicker than if African American is with good, it shows an implicit association between African American and negativity. Right? This has been used many different times. People once talked about using this in reports to identify racial bias, but that didn't hold up, so it's a little bit controversial. But there is something online that you can go to. It's called Project Implicit, where you can take this test for free yourself. Nobody will know your results. The only thing that they ask is that if you could be anonymous, an anonymous participant, and contribute to their large bank of people who have taken the test. So researchers like me can go in and get millions, actually, who have taken this test, millions of participant data and look at that. So you can take it for free if you.
What's it again?
Project Implicit. And they not only have this for race, they have IATs for sexual orientation, whether mothers should be in the home, whether you're biased, to test your bias for these things.
On this test, it was interesting, the skin color is actually almost the same. So the only blackness is the nose is broader.
Yeah, I guess for this one you're saying you couldn't distinguish as much between the blacks and the whites? Okay. It's not very dark at all. So I guess there are just very subtle differences, and they try to see the differences between them.
Well, they're black and white pictures too, so it's not, they're not in color.
True, and there are different variations of this particular paradigm. So sometimes they don't even use faces. Sometimes they just use the word black or white, or black people or white people. Okay, so in this particular work, we're going back to blacks as superhuman. They use an implicit association test, but instead of saying good or bad, they use the word superhuman or human to test to see whether blackness was associated with this superhumanness or this humanness. And what they found, it's evidence right here, was that blacks were associated with superhuman more so than human because the reaction time for pairing these words was quicker for blacks and superhuman than the opposite. Okay, so there's this implicit association between blacks and superhumanness. What does that mean? They later, in studies, showed a black person and a white person, not a prime, just showed them, and then asked the question, which target do you think would be capable of 3 superhuman qualities, right? Is it the black person or a white person? Nobody's threatened by that. They'll answer honestly, right? And which of these people do you think requires more pain medication to reduce the pain they've experienced? So people were more likely to say that the black target would be more capable of the 3 superhuman qualities, and they'd also said that the white target requires more pain medication to reduce the pain that they've experienced. So they did not use these particular pictures that I did. This is just for demonstrative purposes. And they also vary the different pictures. So they use many different primes or pictures of white people to show this. Okay? So what does this overall mean? This means that race, black versus white, was associated with supernatural ability versus human ability, which was associated with an increased threshold for pain. Which was associated with increased threshold for pain. So if you think somebody has a superhuman ability, or is Hulk Hogan, as Darren Wilson said about Mike Brown, then you're going to inflict more force upon them in order to quell the threat, right? Because they don't exactly feel that. They're superhuman. Blacks as adult-like. This is the second to last one. In this study, they had 66 police officers evaluate the people that they had arrested, right? And they evaluated pictures of these people based on their age, how old do you think they are, and their culpability. How likely do you think it was that they committed this crime? They also had data on the complaints against police officers for excessive use of force. So they had that data that they could link to this. Essentially, what they found was that police officers overestimated the age of their culprits who were black when a felony was suspected. So they thought they were older rather than younger. And they also thought when a felony was suspected that they were more culpable of the crime, okay? This is more likely to be their fault. What they find with this is that black versus white is associated with being older versus younger, which is associated with higher culpability for the crime, which was actually statistically linked to their past history of excessive force, or the complaints that they'd received against their perpetrators, as they call it, their perps. Now, I bring this up because there's always a story surrounding this. Tamir Rice, who was killed in Ohio, believed. When police officers found him on the scene, they said, this person, when we saw him, he looked like he was 20 years old. Tamir Rice was 12, and he was fatally shot, right? So that's how this factors into it. If you think that you are dealing with an adult or somebody more of an adult, then you're going to use the force that you would bestow upon a criminal adult rather than a juvenile. Okay, so this last study it's not in the criminal domain, so to say, but I do think it's relevant, and it's one of my studies. I'll show you why it is relevant. There's this measure called social dominance orientation. And that's a measure of somebody's preference for hierarchy or domination against a lower status group. They find that this predicts all sorts of things, but one thing that it predicts is they tend to favor punishment against people that fail to submit or that rise up against them out of their caste or their status. They found again and again that police officers tend to be higher in social dominance orientation than the general public. Okay? In FDA, motives are present in the general public when low-status civilians, blacks in this case, we'll see, try to rise in the status or the power hierarchy. So to lighten the mood, as the last study that I'm going to talk about, we did a study where we talked about excessive celebrations. So if anybody is a fan of the NFL, or was a fan of the NFL prior to this year, they changed the rule, right? I'm happy that my paper's now relevant, I am. Knows that in the NFL, if a person gets a touchdown, and you're super excited about it, and they're celebrating, they could have been punished with a penalty of 10 yards, or they could have been fined a particular amount for excessively celebrating. Because to them, it looked unsportsmanlike and it looked like hubris, right? They're cocky, right? They're coming out of character. So we looked at this, though, because we felt like it seems like these excessive celebration calls are always called on the black players as opposed to the white players. We looked at the data for this, and we found that black players compose 65% of the NFL compared to white players, which are 31% of the NFL, and then there's an other category. However, 92% of these calls were called on black players and only 8% on white players. So you guys know there's a natural question you should be asking after this, which is, maybe black players just tend to celebrate more, right? And that we can get at experimentally. So that's what we did. We gave out this fictional report of Malik Johnson, who went down, scored a touchdown, and excessively celebrated, or Jake Bierman, who was the white football player who excessively celebrated. Everything else was identical about how we describe their excessive celebration, except the race was manipulated. And exactly what we found was that when a black player excessively celebrated, people wanted to give them less of a reward, this difference here, than when they did not celebrate, but this wasn't the case for the white player at all, okay? So we didn't notice that they were being punished at all for their excessive celebration. What does this have to do with the police killings, right? We know that police officers are higher in the social dominance orientation, that if somebody rises up against them and comes out of their place, that they're more likely to inflict or favor severe punishment for them, right? In these situations, if they feel like a black man is coming off as cocky or that they're trying to talk back to them or something of that sort, then that drive for social dominance kind of kicks in and the punishment then follows. So this blackness, it might just be the blackness that scares them, right? We've seen blacks as violent criminals, blacks as sub and superhuman, black youth as adult-like, and blacks as hierarchy disruptors. And all of these things are kind of encoded in blackness that may be psychological antecedents of the problems that we're witnessing. That's the end of the studies that I'm going to show, but I do want to invite questions that you might have about any particular studies or anything at all. There was one in the back, and then I'll take you a second.
John is going to run around with the mic so you get picked up on the webcast.
President Trump claims to be the least racist person of anybody.
He does make that claim.
Which is a good statement. What worries me, though, his base probably believes that. What social impact would there be in terms of his base, in terms of their behavior in society, if you get what I'm trying to say here?
Yes, I think I do understand what you're saying, that Trump self-professes to be the least racist, most benevolent person on so many scales that you know, right? And that his base is following everything that he says. One thing that I do personally feel that the Trump administration has done is kind of embolden people, right? So this might come in subtle ways, but there are other ways that are pretty overt. Now you see people launching KKK signs across highways, crossing highways across. You've seen a rise in hate crimes, so to say, too, because I think he is legitimizing this behavior and saying, well, I'm the president, I'm telling you I'm not racist, this behavior is just natural. So to the extent that we normalize behavior like that and there's no accountability saying it's racist at all, I think it's definitely going to embolden his base in the future, people who might come follow him to feel I'm not racist at all, but I can demonstrate these behaviors.
My question is about the terms Black and African American.
Sure.
Over my lifetime, obviously, there's been a lot of terms used. And it seemed to me that there was kind of a change at one point when we called everybody Black, and then we started talking about African Americans. But you're talking here about prejudice more toward the term Black. I'm just curious about that. And what do you think at this point in time, the most respectful term to use for our brothers and sisters who have some Black blood?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with your first question, giving you a little bit of context of how theoretically we situated our study with Black versus African Americans. So it started off because I can't quite remember the year, so I don't want to misquote, but I think it was 2013 or something of the sort where they took Negro off the U.S. Census. And this was a big thing. It was in the news. They said it's outdated. It's not a kind word. We're not going to say Negro anymore. But then nobody did any research about the remaining words that were on there. It was just given that African American and Black were still on there, right? In the way that these terms developed, Black came out of this Black Power movement. It was really championed by Stokely Carmichael, right? I'm Black and I'm proud.
Black is beautiful.
Black is beautiful. All these different themes. African American came around the late 1980s, really, and it was from Jesse Jackson. And there was a conference in December of 1988 where he says, my people want to be called African American. And African American, he said, was a better term to use because it tied you to a land base, which was Africa. Everybody else, they were Irish Americans or they were Native Americans. Well, not that. They were Arab Americans. It tied you to a particular place, and that place denoted culture. So I think my people should be called African Americans, right? What we argue in the paper was originally black was encoded in all this hatred that had come up from the years that it was used, that when African American came out, it was really just used as a subtype rather than changing how blacks or African American people of color were perceived. So when I say it was a subtype, it was, I think Obama is an African American, but these black criminals over here, these black thugs or whatever, and you notice in the media that they're used in different ways for different people, right? So African American we have an empirically tested, African American may be used a little bit more for Obama, where you could still hold the stereotype for blacks in general, but still have this subtype of about these few talented 10th people, right? That are anomalies, right? They've made it to be successful, but I still think the majority of blacks are like this. So we think that subtyping was kind of encoded in these different words and their usage today, and that comes off in the experiments about how people perceive them.
Well, what about the preferred term?
Yes, that was your second question. Thank you for keeping me on track. Mind them. Preferred term. I would suggest that you follow the lead of the person who says it. So for me personally, I thought it just was so odd that they'd respond back to me and say African American when I said black. I personally prefer the word black. It reminds me of these undertones of black is beautiful and things of that sort. And to me, to not say black, it does water down a little bit of my race or what I am personally so proud of. What I hope for society is that we can just change these connotations around black so we can say it without it being a scary word. That we can kind of take that term back and make it something as beautiful as the themes were around like the 70s when afros and blacks and black power was a thing of pride, which we don't see as much of today. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. He's been praising us here for a very long time. I promise it.
So in your NFL study, shouldn't you control for the position? In other words, certain positions lead to more celebratory function than others.
Yeah.
And you'll need to repeat the question for the webcast.
Absolutely. So the question was, in your NFL study, shouldn't you control for position? So we have several studies. This is just archival research that we use, but we do break it down by position. So it's a defensive back, linebacker, running back. So you can see the different percentages off of what black players are and white players are, and then the penalties that are bestowed upon them. So we looked at that, but experimentally, both of the players were the same position, so we held that constant, and then we saw whether people had any punishment against them.
The second question is to deal with this. You were in Chicago.
Yes.
And I don't know whether these studies were done in Chicago, but if you were to take these studies and do them in New York and Atlanta and Los Angeles, would you expect there to be a difference?
I do think
Repeat the question.
Yes, thank you for the reminder. I told you, you got to keep me on track. The question was, presumably these studies were done in Chicago, and if these studies were done in other locations, so Los Angeles, I don't remember New York, do you think that you would get different results? So these particular studies were done on a platform called Amazon Mechanical Turk. And what that is an Amazon platform that provides participants to you from around the nation. So this was a nationwide sample. We don't have enough statistical power to look at the different states within that, but I do presume that you would get more prejudice in places that are more associated with prejudice.
Okay, the microphone's in the back, please.
So Greg, approximately what percentage of the members of this group are black? So apparently there are a lot of hypotheses as to why that's true. Here's an study, for example.
Yes, absolutely. I want to go around with the mic, I think.
Can I ask you about, and I think this is probably your next paper, which is the justice system's response to these things. The one that was just, to me, the worst one is the man who was strangled on
he was selling cigarettes, and the police officers, and he kept saying, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, and they did not even indict the police officers. And is that going to be your next paper, possibly?
I don't know how you know this, but yeah.
Well, because it seems to me that you can address, on the ground, you can address the police officers. The police officers have acted in a certain way, but when they get into the justice system, those police officers, even the ones, and again, I used the one where the man was saying, I can't breathe, and they were clearly killing him no question. They didn't even indict them, and I wonder where that comes, where we can kind of think about what the justice system should better do.
Yes. So I do wish that I had time to go into the blue part of the paper, which talks about police departments and how their culture is created, right? But there is a thing called the brotherhood, where they are in a dangerous profession, right? So it's important to them, culture-wise, to have each other's backs, so to say. And that having each other's backs even extends to the judicial system, where I think it's harder to indict a cop, right? Because everybody in there is looking out for their brother, right? But in the paper, I do talk about other mechanisms from the blue perspective that make it harder to indict these things. You are absolutely correct in that our next project talks about accountability and shooter bias also. We're going to do experimental studies and manipulate how accountable people would be if they were wrong, if they erroneously shot a black person and that person was unarmed. Right now in these studies, there's no consequences. These undergraduates get up from the computer, walk away, and they have an ice cream, right? Nothing happens. But what if we were to say that there's a higher likelihood that you could go to jail for this? Would we see any difference in implicit behavior? So it's still an empirical question and something that we're working on right now.
Question in the back.
You may have mentioned is, where are these papers available for us?
I can actually send them, for sure.
And we might be able to link to some through the newsletter.
Okay.
That would be really, really appreciated so very much.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this by way of thanking you. Discussions like this are rare, and especially for people who are in intellectual class. We can escape this very easily. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Here comes the mic.
Yeah. One of the problems with the term African American is, and I apologize to the person I'm going to do this to, one of the people in this group is African American. Not you, but someone in the audience.
Okay.
But I bet you can't find him.
So one of the interesting things about implicit bias is that in general, there seems to be an implicit bias towards the unfavored group. And the implicit bias can be held by members of the favored and unfavored group in the same direction. So, for example, there's a famous study that came out recently of faculty, and research faculty were more likely to hire a man in a position and to pay the man more, and that was true of both men and women faculty. And so, in terms of these studies, are there enough data about black police shooting unarmed blacks?
Okay. Well, I don't have to repeat the question, right? Because you have a microphone. They are able to get at that experimentally, but we can't look at it archival because there haven't been enough killings from black police officers to unarmed black men, right? But when you look at it experimentally in the shooter bias studies, you do see, even if it's not as pronounced, that there is a tendency more to shoot blacks than whites, even among black police officers. So there is a larger cultural thing. One thing that this reminds me of is, if you remember the study that was done with the two dolls. So this was done a while back, and they either had a black doll or a white doll. And they had kids come in, and they had to say, you know, what doll do you think is prettiest, or which doll do you want? And they consistently saw that the black children and the white children would pick the white doll. So this is to say that this is a socializing that happened at a very, very young age. I don't think they've pinpointed exactly what age this occurs, but then it pervades until it gets to a point where you're a black police officer and you're also experiencing this as well. So it is definitely a larger problem, even among black people.
So along those same lines, I remember Dorothy Brown talking about a course that she has taught in the law school, something about race in the law or something like that. And before one of her classes, she required that all of her students take the implicit bias test.
Oh, she did.
And she had some of her black students coming to her in tears, saying after they took that test, something happened. They don't know what, but they're not biased that way, and yet the test came out that way. So they were just really incredibly upset by that. But she said one of the consequences of having the whole class take that test is that it turned out to be one of the best classes she'd ever taught that way in terms of discussion, because students could sort of meet each other on a different ground after having taken that test.
Absolutely, and I'd encourage it. It's free and available. You can take any project implicit test. One thing that I did want to talk about, to your point too, was we have these cultural associations in our mind, and it's because we see them on the media, right? And they're oversampled on the media. So even young children witness this, and it's in the back of their mind. You can override your implicit systems. It's hard. It takes conscious effort. But with deliberative effort and egalitarian nature, you can override those associations that you have with blacks and criminality. This is what we see in the trainings that they do with the shooter bias. So that's why I think it's always important. It's not about whether you're racist or not. We all have bias. I very much have bias. It's what you acknowledge and then can start to try to override so that these associations that you have don't come out in your behaviors and adversely affect people.
We had B, and I saw Mary Lynn, and Don had his hand up earlier.
Yeah, I'm very proud of being an African American. But the problem is, many of the blacks, if we can use that, don't see me as an African American. I was born in Africa. I'm very proud because of my evolution that the blacks were the ones who, if you go back enough, were the ones who started Homo sapiens. Therefore, since I like evolution, I like America, and I like you, the blacks, I'd like to be called, and I feel very unhappy because we cannot call me an African.
No, I understand your point too. African American draws you to a certain base, one of which most blacks have never visited, actually, either. So there is contention even with the black community about whether the African American word is appropriate for blacks who don't feel that connection to Africa. And even if you think of slave ships, a lot of us weren't brought here directly from Africa either. So my history dates back, my family is still in Barbados, right? So when I think of past cultural heritage, I think of Barbados, and I think of the West Indies and Caribbean food.
You're not going back enough.
Yes. No, I'm not going back. But I'm just saying it's an interesting question too, because you feel more culturally associated with Africa, where some blacks don't even feel culturally associated for Africa. I mean, if we're up to me, I would call you African American. I don't have any problem with it, especially if that's what you culturally associate with.
But Andy has another problem. He's an African American Jew.
That's intersectionality at its finest.
I'm Asian, or Spanish, or Italian.
I'm going to be an interesting experiment. I grew up in Germany. Had never seen a black, never heard of a black. I mean, I had absolutely no preconceived notions whatsoever when I came to this country at age 15. I had met, before that, just after the war, a few black American soldiers first that came after the war. And that had a very positive association because they gave us kids Hershey bars and chewing gum. So when I came, I had no prejudice. Now I'm going to take this project implicit and I see how it comes out. If I acquire any prejudice.
Oh, that will be a very interesting test case, for sure.
John, could I have it just for a minute? That was Benania speaking. I forgot to mention something earlier. I'll just mention it now. Once again, Bea has been good enough to bring some copies of her book about living in Berlin when she was young. It's called Shrapnel and the Piano. It's for sale out here, and she's giving all of the proceeds to the Emeritus College. So if you're interested, pick up a copy on the way out.
So there was an article, I think in the New York Times this morning, that I just read quickly, but it's about this study that they used census data and they looked at outcomes of white boys and black boys from, they called them boys, from similar neighborhoods, similar socioeconomic backgrounds, so they came from good families or poor families, but the bottom line was, the one outstanding thing was that the boys from good neighborhoods with high economic status, good education, the white boys came out better than the black boys in terms of future economic status, good jobs, things. The discrepancy wasn't so great among the women, the girls who came out of these things. And I thought it's being hailed as a sort of a groundbreaking study. But one interesting thing as I read it was, again, my own perception. And, you would hope that your first thing was, well, why didn't these boys, the black boys, get the same opportunities? But the other perception that comes to your mind, and I tried to push it out and say, oh, I'm not thinking this, was why couldn't they take advantage of all their opportunities and be there? And it was like stark to me to actually feel that prejudice.
So I think that's a natural reaction. What I like about experimental research is that it's kind of get at the heart of whether there were causal factors. Was it that the black boys didn't take advantage of the opportunities, or was it something a little bit more insidious? There was this really fascinating experimental research paper, in my opinion, and what they did was they did a field experiment. Okay, so they sent out resumes of either a black person, fictional, but black person, or white person, and they applied to many different jobs around the area. So several hundreds of this, right? And people are getting all these fictional jobs. And they looked at who would be hired or who would be called back. Now, one thing that was different about this particular study was they had people either go to Harvard, so it was a Harvard graduate, or it was a University of Mass Amherst graduate, because they wanted to control for the particular region. What they found was that a black male graduate from Harvard would be called back less than a white male graduate from UMass Amherst. Yeah. So even these kind of affiliations or this status, right, of going to Harvard couldn't buffer him from the racial bias. And everything else was identical about these fictional things. And this was a field experiment that actually took place in the field with real job goers, right?
There's one other African-American woman in this room. When I left Spelman College, I got an honor degree from Marion Wright Edelman as a black woman. actually a black Jewish woman. I just want to point out that what you've talked about is so real, but also every day for black families with young children, especially black boys, children boys. Mothers spend their so much time, especially mothers, but also fathers, warning their black children about confrontations with police all of the time, every day. And so it's not just around us, it's very, very real for black families.
Absolutely, like those are the conversations that we have routinely with my nephews, and you see how it's manifested with my husband, who is he's a very poised person. I mean, he's very accomplished, Harvard Business School graduate, but if a police officer comes into the room, he gets very docile and he starts to shake a little bit, and he's very visibly uncomfortable. So it's interesting to see like something like that happen to somebody who's so accomplished and poised, that threat is just so real. Yeah.
One more question, and then we'll do a round from me, and then maybe we can squeeze in one from Jim. Jim first.
Since you're in the business school, why can't economic sanctions fix this problem?
I mean, I wish. I definitely wish we could get creative. You have to talk to the power holders who aren't as receptive to implicit bias as you all are.
If she ruled the world, right? And this is my question.